Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 7. My name's Caitlin Wood, and I'll be presenting this week on Edward Said's Orientalism, which is an awesome book, and I'm excited to talk about it. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Let's begin by examining the general structure that Said uses to present his argument in Orientalism. So, the book's broken up into 3 major chapters. The first being the scope of Orientalism, second being Orientalist structures and restructures, and the third being Orientalism Now. And each of these 3 chapters contains 4 smaller subdivisions that focus on specific aspects of Orientalism. I'm going to discuss some of the key arguments and claims made in each of these chapters in a moment. But first, I want to make sure that everyone knows exactly what I mean when I say terms like Orient, Oriental, and Orientalist. So the Orient or Oriental is kind of Said's catch-all phrase for a person from the East or who is perceived to be from the East, who is viewed in the West in rather unflattering ways, like they're considered to be unsophisticated, simple-minded, dangerous, often frightening, and all other kinds of really hurtful stereotypes and generalizations. An Orientalist, on the other hand, is usually a person of Western descent who claims to be an expert on the Orient. So they'll write books, publish works of scholarship about them, and it's pretty safe to say that after reading Said's text in its entirety, I know for a fact that it's an understatement to say he's not a fan of Orientalists. He thinks that they really propagate falsehoods, and Said really goes after them in his book and accuses them of talking about this widely diverse group of people as if they can just boil them down to a really small handful of characteristics. And a lot of time, of course, those characteristics are negative. So he really, really is critical of Orientalists in his novel. Similar to this conflict between the Orient and the Orientalist is the relationship between the Orient and the Occident, which is basically just another way of saying the Western world and someone from there. This relationship is considered a binary opposition, which just means essentially that the terms are naturally pitted against each other in an us versus them, east versus west, superior and inferior kind of way. And according to traditional Orientalist thought, the Occident is considered to be superior to the Orient, which leads us quite nicely to the main question that underlies Said's paper. What exactly is Orientalism? As I mentioned in my essay that goes along with this presentation, there really isn't an easy answer to this question because Said offers a number of definitions and theories of Orientalism. For example, he writes in the book that Orientalism is, quote, the historical practice of consolidating knowledge about the Orient into forms that can be studied and conveyed to a Western audience, unquote. And then just a few pages later, he kind of qualifies this by saying that Orientalism is, quote, a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient by making statements about it, theorizing views of it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, and ruling over it. And when Orientalism is examined closely, it shows how European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself out against the Orient as a sort of surrogate, and inferior self, unquote. So to put these kinds of really complicated and vague definitions into more understandable terms, I would say that Orientalism seems to refer to the Western world's impulse to talk about, write about what they believe to be Orientals, and they really want to document them through scholarship in the hope of later making it easier to subdue them and control them. And so Said talks about how Orientalism was a way for people in Western countries to maintain a sense of superiority and to justify their desire for things like imperialism and colonization. In particular, Said focuses on Britain, France, and America in his paper, and he spent a lot of time trying to show how Orientalism gave people like the British and the French the ability to roll over these groups without feeling bad or any sense of remorse, because people from the Middle East were considered to be separate beings. They were literally other, and I mean other with a capital O, to these people. So now let's look at some of the minor points that Said makes in his book. First of all, the opening pages of the first chapter revolve around a man named Arthur James Balfour, who gave a pro-imperialist speech in the British House of Commons in 1910. I'm not going to read the whole speech here because that would take far too long, but essentially the main message of it was that Britain really shouldn't worry about the moral or ethical implications of invading and colonizing Oriental nations like Egypt, because according to Balfour, the Egyptians had turned completely barbaric, and so it was the British responsibility as the bright rational, and civilized people to step in and re-civilize them, to try to restore them and bring them out of their primitive ways. For instance, in one part of the speech, Balfour says that British men like himself, quote, know the civilization of Egypt better than we know the civilization of any other country, and we are in a position of supremacy over great races like the inhabitants of Egypt, unquote. I think it's grand statements like this that reveal one of the core features of Orientalist thought, which is that Orientalism is not really about seeing and describing Orient in an accurate manner, as if that's even possible anyway, given the great diversity of Middle Eastern nations and religions, but rather it's about British or French or American, any Western power really, describing Orients with overly simple generalizations and convenient stereotypes, unfairly perceiving them in negative ways as like being lustful, primitive, simple-minded, greedy, unable to comprehend rational thought, etc. Said writes in his book that for Orientalists like Balfour, quote, British knowledge of Egypt is Egypt. Or put differently, England knows Egypt because Egypt is what England knows, unquote. And this kind of thought process was kind of seen as nothing more than common sense in the West at the time. And as we've already learned in previous weeks of this course, common sense is dependent on culture and context. And it makes groups of people assume certain viewpoints are true without giving much deliberation or reflection to the topic. What's kind of cool is that Said even seems to almost indirectly reference this social conception of common sense in the book when he writes, quote, that Balfour could strip humanity down to such cultural and racial essences was not at all indication of particular viciousness. Rather, it was an indication of how streamlined a general doctrine it had become by the time he put it to use. How streamlined and effective, unquote. Also, even though Said never directly references this particular poem in his book, I wanted to mention Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. For those that know it already, the message of White Man's Burden is kind of horrifying. You kind of get a little sense of a taste of that with the picture to the right. It's only one stanza from the poem. But essentially, Kipling's message perfectly encapsulates what Said is saying about Orientalism, because Kipling takes away the voice of the colonized natives in the poem and acts as if he knows what is best for them, which is, of course, British colonization and being civilized by the British Empire. And this is precisely what Balfour is saying as well in his speech, talking as if, to quote Said, Balfour knows everything about them, the natives, the Egyptians, and what is good for them better than they could possibly ever know themselves, unquote. I definitely think this is one of the most dangerous aspects of Orientalism, and by this I mean its paternalistic attitude, its condescension, and its defense of, well, we can re-civilize and restore the Orient to greatness because we obviously know better than them. It's kind of troubling. In chapter 2, Said brings the concept of types, which we've already learned a little bit about in this class. According to Said, these types provided the person who was making the observations, which in this case obviously means the Orientalist, to ascribe basic physiological and moral characteristics to certain collections of people. And Said makes the argument that Orientalists like to, quote, make out of every observable detail a generalization, and out of every generalization an immutable law about the Oriental nature, temperament, mentality, custom, or type, unquote. So in other words, Orientalists are accused by Said of not really caring about the individuality of the people they're supposedly studying. To them, all Orientals are the same, and they're just one part of one big, large collective type. I think this argument is interesting for a few reasons. First, that it jibes pretty well with what we learned a few weeks ago in one of the lecture videos, that people usually start to resort to types and prototypes when judging others because they're easy and they don't really require a lot of deep thought. And I also really like that it ties in nicely with our class discussion 2 weeks ago on problems with classifying groups of people, such as what happened in apartheid. And Said even kind of touches on this issue indirectly when he says in his paper, quote, whether there is any way of avoiding the hostility expressed by such divisions, say, of men into us, Westerners, and they, Orientals. For these divisions are generalities whose use historically has been to press the importance of the distinction between some men and some other men, usually towards not especially admirable ends, unquote. Finally, let's move on to reviews of Said's book. So there's very little doubt that Orientalism had a profound influence on academia. A ton of papers have been and continue to be written in response to this text, and In particular, it made a big mark on contemporary literature and Middle Eastern studies. I actually first heard of Said when I was an undergraduate student learning and majoring in English because Said, his background is in contemporary literature, and um, after he published Orientalism, he essentially became the founder of what's known as post-colonial theory, which is exactly what I learned about. So I was already a little bit familiar with him. Many scholars had really nice things to say about this book. For instance, a scholar by the name of Sean Haney wrote that, quote, it's a commendable piece of work that traces a line of connection between seemingly unconnected texts in a way that is both rich and illuminating, for it successfully challenges us to consider to what extent seemingly benign or neutral disciplines, such as science or travel writing, can display, perpetuate, and indeed be colonialist. It enables us to engage with contemporary discourse about the Orient with an appreciation of this, unquote. However, this is not to say that the book was free from controversy, because it's definitely far from the truth. In fact, given Said's overt disapproval of professional Orientalists in Western scholarship, again, he essentially called them all racists who profit off their so-called expertise when they label and characterize Easterners as other. So it really should not come as any surprise that the book was immediately criticized heavily in the Orientalist community. For instance, a person named Ibn Warwick called the book, quote, an incoherent and dubious postmodern theory filled with sentimental third worldism, glaring historical errors, and Western guilt, unquote. And I know it's fairly easy to dismiss this negative assessment as merely a reflection of the fact that Said criticized him first, but I think it's important to mention that he wasn't the only scholar to point out possible historical errors in this particular novel. For instance, a scholar named Mark Proudman was merely one person among several who noted that there are certain problems with Said's depiction of history in the 19th century, such as the fact that he only spends a little bit of time explaining how the Ottoman Empire was a dominant Eastern power. And Said's also been accused of being rather selective with his history. The tone of the book has been criticized as being too exaggerated and sarcastic, and Said also apparently sometimes mixes up time periods in his novel. So honestly, I'm slightly conflicted about these critiques because, on the one hand, I think some of them are a little unfair. For instance, I don't think it's fair at all to say that Said completely overlooks the Ottoman Empire in his work. He actually mentions it on several occasions in the second chapter of the book. But on the other hand, I also don't entirely disagree with the assertion that Said glosses over how the Ottomans might relate to and possibly undermine his argument about the Orient being seen as a weak, inferior, and easily defeatable group in the eyes of Westerners. I also agree that the tone Said takes is occasionally surprising, especially when he critiques the Orientalists. I mean, after all, some of these people could have been his peers at Columbia who are working in a nearby building, for all we know. Nevertheless, I think it's safe to say that Orientalism left a huge mark on both fans and critics alike. In conclusion, I want to leave everyone with a quick little quote from the end of the novel, in which Said writes, if the knowledge of Orientalism has any meaning, it is in being a reminder of the seductive degradation of knowledge, of any knowledge, anywhere, anytime, at any time. Now perhaps more than before. I'm excited to hear everyone's discussion, thoughts, and thank you for listening to our presentation. I appreciate it.